Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por venir a esta conferencia del doctor Anthony Fisher el día de hoy. Esta actividad se enmarca dentro de una visita más amplia que el doctor Fisher ha hecho a nuestro departamento de filosofía de la Universidad de Santiago, que comprende tanto esta actividad como un workshop sobre ontología temporal y metafísica del tiempo, que tendrá lugar el día jueves, y también la participación la semana pasada en un workshop, conferencia internacional sobre metafísica contemporánea. El doctor Fisher, lo presento brevemente, es actualmente profesor del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Gonzaga. Previo a esta posición, fue lecturer del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Washington en Seattle y anteriormente investigador postdoctoral del Departamento de la Universidad de Manchester en 2 periodos distintos y de Queen's University en Canadá. Mayormente las áreas de investigación del Dr. Fisher se embarcan en 2 líneas, si bien ambas están conectadas con la metafísica contemporánea. La primera es lo que se denomina la historia de la filosofía analítica, pero en su caso llegando a filósofos tan recientes como David Lewis. El profesor Fisher es el editor, junto con Helen Beebe, de la correspondencia filosófica de David Lewis, publicada por Oxford University Press el año pasado en 2 tomos. Ha editado un libro sobre la obra de David Lewis y actualmente prepara la correspondencia filosófica de David Lewis con el filósofo australiano David Armstrong. Aparte de ello, es editor de un volumen también para Oxford University Press de D.C. Williams, que comprende su obra Metafísica, y previo a ese proyecto también ha publicado una monografía sobre Samuel Alexander, y tiene en preparación un libro sobre la metafísica de C.D. Broad. El día de hoy, la conferencia del Dr. Fisher será precisamente acerca de la obra de D.C. Williams, en particular su legado metafísico y la influencia que dicho legado tuvo en la filosofía contemporánea del siglo XX, particularmente en autores como David Lewis y David Armstrong, entre otros. Saludo también a quienes nos siguen esta conferencia por YouTube. Debería estar abierta la posibilidad de poder hacer preguntas. La idea es que después de un bloque de 40 minutos tengamos 5 minutos, no más de 10, de preguntas antes del break que tendremos programado, y luego también dejar un espacio de al menos 10 o 15 minutos al final del segundo bloque para hacer otra ronda de preguntas. Así que por favor, quienes sigan la conferencia online, dejen sus preguntas en el chat de YouTube y nos preocuparemos de hacer llegar las preguntas al doctor. No me extiendo más, los dejo a ustedes con el conferencista. Thank you very much, Anthony. The floor is yours.
Great, and thank you, Carlo Rossi, and thanks to the Universidad de Santiago de Chile for hosting me as well. You have a fine city here and a fine country. So today I'll be talking about D.C. Williams' metaphysics and its influence on 20th century philosophy, and in particular the history of analytic philosophy and the sort of evolution of metaphysics in the analytic tradition. So analytic metaphysics today is flourishing across the world, from Chile to Canada to Croatia. It is alive and it's doing well. But there was a time in the 20th century where metaphysics was ridiculed, it was shunned and rejected, and just taken to be sheer nonsense and just meaningless and close to poetry, if anything, perhaps even bad poetry. But that was in the middle of the 20th century. But there was, after that, a revival of metaphysics, which is what we sort of stand on today. And there's a question about how did this comeback of metaphysics come about? Who was involved? Who made the contributions, and in what sort of ways? And those are the questions that I'll be interested in this talk, and what I have been interested in my work the last few years. So basically, over the course of the 20th century, if I can do a very quick timeline here from the beginning, roughly with some vague boundaries from 1900 to 2000, and we're off here somewhere in the present moment, marching into the 21st century. There was a time here where from like 1930 to about 1960, where there doesn't seem to be much metaphysics going on, whereas earlier there was, and later on there was as well. Okay, so I think that D.C. Williams plays an important part in the revival of metaphysics, and he was working in this period when metaphysics was out of fashion. And he was a metaphysician who kept metaphysics alive in this time period. And he's influenced by people earlier than him, and also influences people later than him as well. And he plays this sort of connecting role that connects metaphysics across the 20th century. So he influences most notably David Lewis and David Armstrong. Those are two important figures in the latter half of the 20th century who they played a big role in reviving metaphysics, and Williams is a big influence on them, or so I'll show. So what I'm going to do, I've got, as I understand the format, there's two chunks to the occasion tonight. So I just took the liberty of giving them names. So there's lecture 1, and then there's the break, and then there's lecture 2. So lecture 1 will be sketching the history of metaphysics in the 20th century, tracing the influences on Williams's thoughts and saying a bit more about his metaphysics. Then in lecture 2, I will then begin to discuss the impact that he had on metaphysics after him, and then extract some lessons for the history of analytic philosophy. And at that point, these lessons I want us to consider with how we understand metaphysics today and where we want metaphysics to go as well. Because we are now getting on into the 21st century. Lewis and Armstrong are still very much with us. Their work is highly discussed. But there's these questions of where are we going, what's next around the corner. So this is a contribution in the history of philosophy, the history of analytic philosophy, what I'm doing here, but it's also connecting with contemporary philosophy, because this is the history of the moments not that long ago. Okay, so to say a bit more detail of the sketch, the overall overview I just gave just now. So as I said, metaphysics is alive in the analytic tradition. Here's a recent special issue in the Humanities Journal of Valparaiso. And this issue is packed with metaphysics of composition and coinciding objects and properties. And those are classical debates, main debates in contemporary metaphysics. Here's some other books that are very recent as well, talking about properties and facts and modality and necessity and possibility and ontology just in general. And I could have added many more pictures of books and works to the slide as well. Now, in the beginning of the 20th century, we have the beginnings of analytic philosophy. So these figures are writing in the late 19th century and also in the early 20th century. We have Frege and Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and the early Wittgenstein, and they are the founding fathers of the analytic tradition, a tradition that had a focus on logic, scientific method, also a realism and a general sort of reaction to the more dominant tradition at the time, which was British idealism. So here's Bradley and Bernard Bosanquet and Harold Joachim, and these are your sort of classical, common British idealists that Russell and Moore and so on were reacting to. This was the paradigm in England, idealism. So I won't go into details, speak about the views, but what analytic philosophers were doing was they were rejecting British idealism in one way or another. And then we get the sort of rise of the early stages of analytic philosophy, early analytic philosophy. Now we get to the 30s. So again, let's get to this period here where logical positivists in the Vienna Circle in Austria came about and got together to see how they could forward this understanding between logic and science and conceive of philosophy. And these figures were also influenced by a reading of Wittgenstein and his Tractatus that was very anti-metaphysical as well, where they thought that in the Tractatus, what Wittgenstein was saying was metaphysical propositions are actually meaningless, and we should not sort of study or care about meaningless sentences or statements or anything like that. So these figures were sort of anti-metaphysical, and they were sort of at the beginning here of this anti-metaphysical period in the middle of the 20th century. So for them, they thought that metaphysical theories are nonsense, meaningless, and this is linguistic confusion in someone's mind, in the mind of the metaphysician. So this is partly because the metaphysical statement is not verifiable in experience, and if it's not verifiable, then it's going to be meaningless according to their conception of meaning. There might be certain statements about necessary truth that are relevant in philosophy, and those would just be trivial by definition in virtue of the meaning of the words, and that gets taken care of just by pure definition. If there's any sort of empirical facts of the matter, they'll be taken care of by science. So science is okay for the logical positivists, and unverifiable propositions are just straight up meaningless. So they would interpret Bradley's absolute idealism as just involved in unverifiable statements about this idealist reality, about the absolute, according to Bradley, and Bradley's not really saying anything about the world. So for the this time period here, logical positivism, changes and morphs as well, but it really begins to take over because a lot of these figures end up in the US, and A.J. Ayer on the right here, he's actually British, but he popularized logical positivism in the 30s in Britain. So my former teacher, Jose Benedetti at Syracuse University, he's a very old philosopher. He was born in the 20s, so he was a young man in this period here, and he used to tell me logical positivism was like a bombshell. Like when it dropped, it was a big bombshell, and you were either in or you were out, and you really had to say something about logical positivism. Whether you liked it or you didn't, you had to talk about it. That's how big it was in this time. Okay, now when we look back from our sort of perspective, we see that there's a slow recovery is made in the 1960s. It's kind of vague, the boundaries. So we have This is Quine's work from 1948. So even in the 50s, we get some sort of metaphysics going on, and which is going to be the sort of seeds for the revival of metaphysics in the latter half of the 20th century. So Quine was an important critic of logical positivism, and he had famous debates with Carnap about how to understand ontology and ontological questions. And he, as sort of the history goes on, his sort of side of things became more prominent. Whether he was right or not is a different matter, but he just his side, particularly this work of his, was very, very influential in forwarding how we talked about metaphysics. So what Quine does in this paper is he gives us a way to understand and formulate philosophical disagreement in ontology that improves our understanding of debates in ontology, but how we can understand saying that something exists and someone else may disagree with us and say that other things exist. So for Quine, the way we would sort of say that something exists is to put it into logical notation where we quantify over something. So to be is to be the value of a bound variable is his famous line. Now, one thing Quine does in this paper is he untangles Plato's beard, and he does that by giving us a new meta-philosophical way to understand debates about the existence of Platonic types, Platonic entities, or numbers, and he goes through a number of debates in this paper. Okay, so what he was doing, well, one sort of effect of his contribution is that in carving out a way to do metaphysics, at least one way, was showing us how metaphysical inquiry might be legitimate. And there's lots of discussion about Quine's work and other works by Quine as well in this time in the 50s and in the 60s. Okay, here are some other developments that I have on another sort of rough timeline. These are other factors occurring in the 60s, 70s, which sort of is pushing metaphysics forward in sort of many different ways. So what I'm trying to do is sort of isolate some sort of connections, some threads through these sort of factors. So P.F. Strawson's an ordinary language philosopher, but in his book Individuals, he was doing some sort of descriptive metaphysics. So he was happy to take metaphysics as legitimate in some sense. In the 50s and in the 60s as well, we had further advancements in logic, particularly modal logic, and use of possible world semantics at this time with Carnap, Montague, Lewis. I can't read that twice. Okay. Also, Crippi and Putnam, they had work on trying to marry together a necessary truth that was also a posteriori. Again, that's an advance from the older paradigm where any a posteriori truth would be contingent. And out of their work, there was also developments in theories of reference, direct reference, and also some sort of essentialism that both Crippi and Putnam endorsed. And when we sort of have this sort of essentialist view put forth, that, for instance, you have an essential origin, that's sort of getting us a metaphysical claim at that point. Similarly, with U.T. Place and Jack Smart and David Armstrong in the 60s, they were, in the philosophy of mind, were interested in developing the identity theory of mind, that the mind is the brain, and that's sort of a general materialism, that everything in the world's material or physical. And they're also interested in scientific realism as well, which says that science refers to and discovers real objects out in the world that the science is about. So physics is really referencing and referencing and confirming the existence of electrons and protons and quarks and whatever else the physics says or the science says. So when we get to, so that sort of claim is again pointing us to a metaphysics, claims about metaphysical claims, which are about things that we don't directly experience. Similarly, in the 70s, we get The Nature of Necessity, is an important book by Plantinga, and other philosophers like David Lewis, who I've already mentioned, start to ask these questions about like the nature of necessity and what is possibility, what in the world answers to our concepts of necessity and possibility. And again, those things is an orientation towards metaphysics, a far cry from what was going on in the logical positivists in the middle of the 20th century, who would say that these questions are just bad questions to ask. And lastly, David Armstrong, again, more in the 70s, but in the late 60s as well, was writing on universals and laws of nature and a posteriori realism, which again is sort of deferring to science to tell us what's in our ontology. These questions are just straightforward metaphysical questions about what fundamental categories characterize our world or characterize reality. Okay, so what is thriving today exactly? Here are a few things, and this is not an exhaustive list. So now I'm sort of pointing to like also to the 21st century now and what metaphysics is going on now. So I think you find a legitimacy of metaphysical statements, of metaphysical theories. Metaphysicians think that a priori knowledge is in some sense valid. Metaphysical questions are legitimate questions. And there's an appeal to an empirical method in metaphysics, often to sort of inference to the best explanation. Those arguments get readily made in metaphysics, and also a general realist disposition too. Most people would sign up to being a realist. There is an external world independent of our minds and what we say and what we think. It has a structure and we can understand it, we can know it using some empirical methods, perhaps some a priori reasoning thrown in as well. And metaphysics is a legitimate form of inquiry. Maybe there are other things we can add to. As I said, the list is exhaustive. Okay, so now I want to do some sort of argumentation at the level of me contributing to the history of analytic philosophy. So we have this question, as I started off with, how do we understand the evolution of metaphysics across the 20th century? So Robert Stallnaker has a claim which is as follows. So metaphysics is revived in the second half of the 20th century. It's due to a crumbling of logical positivism and linguisticism, which I'm sort of including in that ordinary language philosophy and the later Wittgenstein as well. Those are anti-metaphysical standpoints. And this is what gives rise to metaphysics. And then Robert Stallnaker says contemporary metaphysicians are heirs of the philosophical tradition that began with the rejection of metaphysics. So again, these guys rejected metaphysics, and that's what the guys in the second half of the 20th century, they're the heirs of that. Okay, so that's the claim. That's the claim I want to resist. So what looks like, so a way to represent this, as I already have on the board, is there's a gap of no metaphysics or very little metaphysics going on here, and also no metaphysics that is influencing the next stage in the history. So my counterclaim is that, well, Williams, D.C. Williams here, he keeps metaphysics alive in this period here when there's little to no metaphysics going on. And what that shows us is there's some continuity of metaphysics across all these three periods of the 20th century. So what it's showing us is a more nuanced view about the evolution of metaphysics. It's also showing us where these empirical methods of metaphysics, some of them, where they come from. Some of these empirical methods come from Williams, and he himself has his own sort of interesting history also, which I'll get into very shortly. So what I want to argue for is what we might call the continuity hypothesis. There is some continuity of metaphysics in this time. There are other philosophers who are doing metaphysics in this middle period as well, but they don't have the same impact that Williams does. There are some figures in this time which we can put Quine and Gustav Bergman, we can put them in this sort of period as well. I think that they're also doing metaphysics and they do have an impact. But the interesting thing about Williams, the distinctive feature of Williams, is he wasn't reacting to, he wasn't buying into the logical positivism of the time or influenced and growing out of it like Quine and Bergman were. So Bergman, for instance, he started off as a logical positivist and then sort of changed course in the middle of the 20th century. And Quine, although we don't really count him as a logical positivist, he was in some ways in criticizing it, taking on and inheriting certain logical positivist views. Whereas Williams isn't like that. So Williams, he's already made up his mind, he's already come to his own views, but influenced by other people who believed in metaphysics in this period. And so when logical positives came along, he straight away, his reaction was, what is this? I don't think this is right. And argued against it early on, but he never was caught up in it, whereas Quine and Bergman were. So it makes him distinctive in that regard. So he influences David Lewis and David Armstrong. And of course, Lewis and Armstrong are influenced by Quine, particularly Lewis. So I'm not saying Williams is the only influence on these two figures. I'm just trying to highlight the connections between these folks. And we can certainly talk about how Quine and Williams and other people come into the story as well. So that's also getting into the details, the nitty-gritty. Right. So I'm going to talk briefly about who was Williams, because you've heard a bit about him, and I have said like the role he plays, and I'll just give you some brief sort of biographical remarks on him to set some more historical context. So he was born in California, 1899. He started off studying English literature at Occidental College. He then goes on to study philosophy at Harvard, and then he goes back to California to Berkeley to study philosophy and psychology, and then back to Harvard to complete his PhD. So he was part of this interesting connection between Berkeley and Harvard. So he was not the only one who was sort of bouncing back and forth. At the student level and at the professor level, these two universities had like a coast-to-coast hub in America. So a lot of famous philosophers sort of ping-ponging back and forth between these two universities, and Williams was just sort of caught up in that, or profited from that. When he's done with his PhD, supervised by Ralph Perry, a new realist at Harvard and successor to William James, he gets a Sheldon traveling fellowship. That's all what the gentlemen of the time typically did, and off they went to Germany or to France, and sometimes England, to further their education, to become more refined gentlemen. Williams spent most of his time in Berlin, and he studied a lot of Gestalt psychology, attending lectures by Wolfgang Kohler and other Gestalt psychologists. He's also in Göttingen as well, and he studied with Moritz Geiger and George Misch as well, and these figures are more related to the phenomenological tradition as well. There's many things to say about his what else he did at this time, but after coming back to the US, he was at UCLA for a little bit, and then finally to Harvard, and he was there until he retired. And he moved back to California when he retired and he died 1983. Now, his teachers are up here now. This is not an exhaustive list of his teachers, but these are ones that stand out. So Ralph Perry, as I said, was his supervisor. He also was taught by C.I. Lewis, John D. Wilde, and at Berkeley by Stephen Pepper and Jacob Lowenberg, and took courses with Whitehead as well, and studied logic textbooks by Ralph Eaton and Henry Sheffer. And Ralph Eaton will become relevant later as well. Now, Williams, when we try to understand who he is, his identity, he's a funny character to place. He's got some analytic aspects to him, but then there are also some non-analytic aspects as well. So if we think of a philosophy in the analytic tradition, typically we think of, well, they are influenced by Russell and more perhaps, and if they're in the middle of the 20th century, perhaps Quine and so on. So Lewis has some of those aspects to him. So he has a Hume-Russell approach to philosophy, as I'll explain it later. He engaged with Carnot and Reichenbach on the legitimacy of induction, and this stuff happened in print. He also engaged with Quine, criticized Quine in various ways. He draws from C.D. Broad and Russell and W.E. Johnston, and these are figures in the Cambridge School of Analysis, which is this one part of the larger analytic tradition. So when you look at that stuff, he's like an analytic philosopher. And I think that's right. We can put him in the tradition of analytic philosophy. But then there's some other aspects to him that aren't analytic. And this stuff gets kind of interesting. So he's influenced by Pepper, that's one of his teachers, and Lowenberg, as I've just shown. But he's also read Santayana and his stuff in metaphysics. He's influenced by Alexander and Bosanquet. Bosanquet's an idealist. Alexander's a realist, but Alexander's a speculative metaphysician with British idealist heritage or vintage. Then there's Perry, who's sort of an analytic philosopher, I suppose, but he's in this time when analytic philosophy is sort of coming of age and isn't sort of grouped typically with Russell, for instance. And other people that you don't know about. So Evander Bradley McGilvary, William Montague, William Savory, Ralph Eaton, and Homer Dubs. So these, some of these people I've had to look up as well more recently. So he's influenced by those figures too, and in an important way. So there are some non-analytic aspects to it. And here's an example of this. So in 1951, he publishes The Myth of Passage and The Sea Fight Tomorrow. These are classic papers in analytic philosophy. If you were to read on the philosophy of time, and you were to pick up an anthology on the philosophy of time or in metaphysics, in the time section, you would have at least one or two of these papers, probably the Myth of Passage. And so these are canonical works. But in the same year, he published this on the credibility of personalism. And personalism is a view held by Edgar Brightman at the time from Boston University. And Edgar Brightman was a friend of Williams, and they corresponded in this time. And Williams was well acquainted with personalism, the view that there are only minds, and these minds are actually persons, and God's going to end up being a person in this sort of metaphysics. But there's no real physical reality on the personalist picture. So in the same year that William publishes these two works, he publishes this not really analytic sort of paper on personalism. So he's got his feet in both non-analytic and analytic. And what this shows us is that some of the history of analytic metaphysics has some non-analytic sources. For instance, like Selwyn Alexander, not really an analytic philosopher, but he had his own role to play in the evolution of analytic metaphysics, given his connections with Williams. All right. So for the rest of this lecture, and I'll try and reorient things given the time, I'm going to say more about Williams' metaphysics and some influences, and maybe I'll skip over some of that. Then the lecture 2, which is going to be after the break, I'm going to examine his impact on Lewis and Armstrong. Then we get to the lessons for history of analytic philosophy. Right. So here's a list of his metaphysical positions, or his more philosophical positions, and I'll talk about a number of them, not in this order, but sort of go back and forth as they relate to one another. So he's a realist in almost all respects, and the realist thinks that there's a real world. It's independent of what we say and what we think, and we can discover things about it. So he holds a methodological realist view. That's like his method. He's a realist method, which is we want to find using evidence and appeals to data of observations given an experience, what the correct theory of the world is. So for him, he's also a metaphysical realist, which we can distinguish with methodological realism. And the metaphysical realist says, well, there is this real world, and it's this physical, mind-independent world. But methodological realism might lead us to the view that idealism is true. So he wants to distinguish methodological realism from metaphysical realism. Methodological realism is more connected with empiricism, appealing to experience in certain ways to confirm a theory once the theory is being constructed and made meaningful. He also thought that all factual knowledge is known inductively. So when we have a claim about the world, what the world is really like, well, that's a factual claim. It's a claim, a matter of fact. How can we know that? Well, we know it inductively. We can't deduce knowledge of the structure of reality, what it's like. We can't do that on this view. We can't know a priori what the world is like. Using metaphysical methodological realism, he also argued for the view called metaphysical naturalism. And this view just says that the world consists of things in space-time. All that there is a system, one system of space-time. And another way to put the point is a more recent label called physicalism. So we can equate naturalism and physicalism as well. Another doctrine that he held about our world is what he calls actualism. And again, he uses another label called factualism as well for this view. So what this view just says is all there is are these determinate actual things. And given metaphysical naturalism, they're in a space-time, and they are related spatiotemporally. There are also parthood relations across these determinate things, actual things. So one can be a part of another. There can be overlap of these entities, and also they can resemble each other as well. So as to imagine a four-dimensional manifold across space and across time with all our actual entities which have properties and stand in relations. And the three fundamental relations are these three: spatiotemporal, parthood, and resemblance. So everything else that we experience, everything else that science tells us about the world can be built up out of these three relations and determinate actual things existing in these, staying in these relations. In ontology and cosmology, he holds two views that have become influential in themselves, and they are still live options in contemporary debates in metaphysics today. So the first one is trope ontology. So a trope is a particular quality. So we could take the whiteness in the piece of paper here, and on Williams's view, the whiteness that this piece of paper has is a particular quality that is in this piece of paper and not in anything else. So it's the trope of whiteness in this paper. And everything in the world is built up out of tropes. So when you look at a substance or a concrete object, like this makeshift lectern, that's this nice plastic box here. This is just a bundle of particular qualities. There's no fundamental substance in which the qualities in here, they're all fused together in a particular region of space-time. So for Williams, there are just tropes. So when we were to plug in actualism with trope ontology, well then the determinate actual entities are going to be tropes, what I call quality contents there. There's a more sort of general term. Now in cosmology, which is a distinct as one area of metaphysics, according to Williams, he holds a familiar view, which is that the past and the present and the future are all equally real. And this is also called eternalism these days. He also held the B theory of time, which is to say that when you have events strung out in a temporal series, that these events stand in earlier than, later than relations to get in a temporal series. And he also holds the view called pejoratism, which is that objects persist by having temporal parts. And I'll explain, this view will come back later on in lecture 2. So these are his views about time. And again, these views are also still discussed today. Okay, so I'll just talk briefly about some influences on his thought, and then jump over to his empirical metaphysics. So he's influenced by Alexander and Bosanquet. As I said, Alexander's a realist. He believed that the world is just a world of space-time. And Bosanquet, although he's an objective idealist, there were certain things that he argued for that Williams adopted. One thing was a notion of patterns of action. So Williams thinks that the world is composed of patterns of action, like action as or active things or events in a spatiotemporal manifold. And he gets some of that from Bosanquet. There's a few other things in Bosanquet as well that he's influenced by. Another influence, again, coming from the early part of the 20th century, is from his teacher, Perry, and the New Realist movement more generally, of which Perry is a part, and then Russell as well. So the New Realist, influenced by Russell, had a scientific approach to philosophy and an atomistic one as well, reducing complex things down to their simpler parts. So here's some quotes from Russell. I'll just go through the first one very quickly, the first one only. So he says, what I wish to bring to your notice is the possibility and importance of applying to philosophical problems certain broad principles of method which have been successful in science. So we're applying a scientific method to philosophical questions. So that resonated with the New Realists and Perry, and also with Williams as well. So for Williams, he wanted to, in this empirical understanding, marry realism and empiricism. So realism is, again, says that there's a mind-independent world with objective properties that things have and relations that they stand in to each other. And empiricism is this idea, a very traditional idea, which is that the foreground of conscious experience is the one base where we thus construct the concepts and confirm the conclusions which inform us of the rest of the world. So from our experiential contents, we can build up all our knowledge of the rest of the world. Now, on this sort of reading, there's a couple of readings that you might give of this statement of empiricism that might imply a conflict with realism. So we have a problem here. So realism is saying that there are unexperienced things. Empiricism is saying that an unexperienced thing, well, by definition, an unexperienced thing can't be experienced. But empiricism is telling us that only, you might think, on one reading, only experienced things exist because we don't have any, how can we confirm things that are beyond our experience? So there's a bit of tension here between empiricism and realism. So if you're an empiricist, well, then you can't be a realist, because to be a realist, you would believe in unexperienced things, and those things would be beyond experience, beyond the limits of empiricism. You have to give up empiricism. So the problem goes. But for Williams, his response to this is to show us in his work that the two things are compatible, and indeed that they're better off together. And with them being better off together, we can believe justifiably in unexperienced things that we can infer, and thereby adopt metaphysical claims. So in bringing empiricism and realism together, we can open up metaphysics and adopt the idea that metaphysical claims are meaningful, and then go on to talk about and have debates about what metaphysical claims and hypotheses can be confirmed by experience, by data, and also showing which metaphysical hypotheses are simpler than others, more parsimonious, which ones can explain more of the data that needs to be explained. Okay, let me okay. Right, so another way to understand this is to contrast the positivist with what Williams would call empiricism, his own sort of version of empiricism. So the positivist would say, using some sort of like empirical motivations, only the content of experience exists, nothing else can be named or conceived. So we just have sense data or operations or protocol sentences to work with in building up our knowledge of the world and science and so on. Whereas the empiricist or the factualist, as Williams also uses this label, there are only facts that exist, and a fact is a property instance where you just have like A is F, or this is an instance of a property F. And coupled with this idea is that we can conceive the existence of facts only by abstracting our meanings from experience, and that we can confirm the existence of facts only by finding observable consequences, a consequence of them. And he says this in a letter to Roderick Chisholm. So here, he's trying to get at this idea that with the material and experience, we can use abstraction, we can also use generalization and extrapolation, and get to meanings of things beyond experience. So as he says in this quote up here, the elements and modes of connection we can abstract and impute to other experiences and to entities which are not experienced at all. Therefore, we can talk significantly, so meaningfully, about things in themselves and their inner nature. And then what happens is metaphysics opens up, because we have these competing views about the world, a materialist view, a personalist view, even panpsychism or neorealism, and all of these are metaphysical hypotheses that we can understand in this empirical way, and they're meaningful, and then we can go and have a debate about whether they can be confirmed or not. All right. Jump over this. And over this stuff. Okay. So what's going on in his empirical method is he's got this principle of parsimony. And this principle is very familiar today, which is that we have a hypothesis, and it's most probable when it contains the fewest independent principles from which we deduce the evidence, the facts, or the data to be explained. And in addition, the more facts that a hypothesis explains with its fewer principles, it's our credibility in it will thereby increase as well. So in his understanding of parsimony, it has built into it the notion of simplicity and optimal explanatory power. And then he says it stipulates not for mere economy, but for economical explanation. So he's one of the very first philosophers in the 20th century to adapt parsimony and refine a principle of it and apply it to metaphysical hypotheses and understand metaphysics in this empirical way. Another person who did this and who influenced Williams is William Savory. So he also did the same thing, and he argued that, for instance, the debate between pluralism and monism can be understood in this empirical way. And Savory, in fact, argues that pluralism, a certain version of it, is more simpler than monism. Monism turns out to be an irrelevant hypothesis. These two philosophers, William and Savory, also have debates about what versions of parsimony should be implemented. So Savory, in his 32 paper, implements quantitative parsimony, which is that we should have simpler, a fewer number of things in our metaphysics or in our theory, and that if you have fewer number of things, then that's the better theory to have. Whereas for Williams, he rejects quantitative parsimony, goes in for qualitative parsimony only, but he's also thinking of it in terms of principles or postulates. So he says, this is Williams now, Occam's principle forbids us to multiply not masses of stuff, so that'll be quantitative, not gross tonnage, again, that's sort of a quantitative notion, but rather laws, so these are generalizations, or formal elements, formal being the formal elements of your metaphysics, and defining characters, which I guess would be, again, categorical characters to do with categories. So here's a nuanced understanding of parsimony. Okay, so for him, metaphysics is the most scientific of the sciences, and that's because it tries the hardest to explain every kind of fact by one simple principle or a simple set of principles, and it's the most empirical because every piece of evidence is directly relevant to and can confirm or falsify or be falsified or confirmed by every item of experience. Anything that's given experience is relevant, for instance, for confirming a metaphysical theory. So, for instance, in his famous paper, The Elements of Being, Williams gives us this story of these three lollipops as his sort of starting example to motivate, one, the problem of universals, and two, to show us that there's some evidence to support his explanation of why the lollipops resemble each other. This has to do with the tropes that they each have. So the idea is we can appeal to ordinary experience, and it's going to give us some examples that we can describe, and then we can explain that example using some ontology, and then that example is going to be a piece of evidence that's going to support the theory, or it may falsify the theory or go against the theory as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there, just in the interest of time, because I want us to stay roughly on time. I've already mentioned trope theory and his four-dimensional manifold theory. So I just leave the slide up there, and we can go into some questions, Carlo, about Williams and
Yeah.
Nothing that have been said.
Let me. Okay, thank you, Anthony. No sé si hay preguntas. Veo que Joaquín tiene una, Sebastián también. Solo decir algo muy breve para quienes siguen la presentación por el chat, o sea, por el canal de YouTube. Entiendo que hay que activar un perfil en el chat de YouTube. Es bastante fácil. Yo lo hice para probar, en fin. Simplemente se los comento por si quieren dejar algún comentario. Incluso si tuvieran algún comentario de esta primera parte de la conferencia, lo pueden dejar ahí y lo hacemos hacia el final. No veo por ahora ninguna pregunta por ahí. Me parece que ni Joaquín ni Sebastián tendrán problemas de traducción con la pregunta. Si alguien quisiera hacer una pregunta, se puede perfectamente traducir al inglés. No hay ningún problema. Si no se sienten cómodos preguntando en inglés, por supuesto, proveeremos asistencia. Joaquín.
Thanks, Anthony, for very, very interesting. Thanks. So, I find Williams an extremely contemporary metaphysicians. I think there's a lot more that we will see the effects. But my question concerned with this, like one slide that you skipped about metaphysical oddities and about the power stuff.
Yes.
So, like, I mean, I'm just curious about, in your view, why rejecting powers, given that, for example, we appeal to ordinary experience to, you know, justify or like give credence to our metaphysical claim. And here's one thing that always like struck me a bit fascinating about Williams is that you can, you know, you can use your experience to justify more like Humean views of like one quality after one other, like no, we still use tools and, you know, tools and left, whatever. But on the other hand, if you read Williams' stuff on tropes, you might even think like there's an obvious sense in which these tropes really affects us. And you know, like I'm just curious about whether like you're aware of like any motivation in addition to maybe like some distaste for the notion of power, for thinking that an explanation of the effects of the qualities that we perceive producing us cannot be given or is unsuitable to be cast in terms of powers.
Yes, yeah, good. So yeah, so there's this the question is, you know, we have this factualist picture here, and then he says a bit more about it here, and then it is true that he wants to then say, hang on, there's some consequences which are Humean consequences, which is that, hey, there are no powers or substantial forms of prime matter or like real necessary connections in nature. And then how do we make that jump? That's the question. Okay, so I think for him, in a very sort of classical empiricist way, he wants to find that the impression that's going to correspond to the idea of a power or a substantial form or prime matter or a necessary connection, say, between two events. So for him, he just thinks that they aren't found in experience. So even with the power, we can focus on the example of a power. We're going to experience the effect of it, and we're not going to experience any modality that of a power that a certain effect must come about. So he does have this Humean, atomistic, and I guess in some ways like a sensationalist view of experience as well, where we have our impressions. That's sort of our rock base in our empiricism, and we don't find them. So he's following also Russell and William James in that matter as well. They both of them also said, no, we can't find these things in experience. Now William's got a couple of moves he can make. So in this letter to Chisholm, so this is page 1 of this long letter to Chisholm, he says, well, maybe you think that you can have an idea of a power using a faculty of reason, somehow interlocking with experience, perhaps, and that's your way to get to a power. So maybe you could say that in response. And for him, we now see more of a stringent empiricism going on. So another sort of slide I skipped over was the way he divides up ways of knowing. So he's a realist over here, and he thinks that we don't have this extra genuine, sui generis faculty of reason that can give us knowledge about things in the world. So he classifies a rationalist view over here as a form of mysticism. Coupled with, next to romanticism of all things, right? He has rationalism next to romanticism. So maybe you could have a rationalistic empiricism, which I think some friends of Powers kind of have. And maybe there's some sort of Kantian elements to it as well, perhaps. So for him, he's going to reject that. He's going to say, okay, tell me more about this sui generis faculty of reason. Tell me more about it, and how do you know about it, and is it reliable, and will it give you infallible results or fallible results, and so on. So he wants questions there. And then I think another thing he would we go the wrong way. Another thing he would say is if an anti-Humean comes back to him and says, well, look, I do in fact perceive and I do conceive the power, and starts to give examples to him, then he would say, well, one, again, I don't find these things myself. And he goes on to say, I have this on the another sheet that I didn't I left this material off, but it's great that you brought this up. He has like another indirect route, which is again to appeal to his empirical metaphysics, which is to say, let's put that dispute to one side. It's kind of a dispute about what we experience. And maybe there's an impasse. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reject these entities as follows. I'm going to quote just more of this letter now. And he says, I reject these entities because, and here comes the quote, I find that it is possible to construct without them a very coherent and credible view of the world, satisfying the demands of those types of experience which all of us agree on, or all of us agree we have, answering the problems posed by the philosophers from time immemorial, absorbing and explaining the results of the natural sciences, and so on and so forth. So then there's sort of a indirect argument. I am now just going to build a counter theory, an alternative theory, or build my theory without reference to powers, and build up everything that needs to be explained. And you agree with that data to be explained. Now, if I can succeed in doing that, I can show that powers are now irrelevant. So bracketing the experiential debate and whether we experience them, I can show they're explanatorily irrelevant.
Cool, thanks.
Un momento, Sebastián, brevemente, porque ya estamos un poco.
Well,
Sorry, I was just saying, Anthony, very briefly, because we already are very
okay. It's a short question, but if you need to answer lately with more information, that's okay. Actually, it has relation with Jacqueline's question. I was wondering, how does he really dissolve the tension between empiricism and realism? Because in that slide you say that he does, like he believes that they are compatible, but and it's not clear to me that they are, especially when you have in his ontology like so sparse material. Like typically someone who is an empiricist will allow, for instance, that tries to combine empiricism and realism, will allow the existence of, say, concrete universals that they can, in a way, transcend the present moment, so you can make inferences to other moments that are not present in your experience. How does he manage to make this compatible?
Right. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, so firstly, he thinks we've got some reliable empirical procedures such as abstraction, generalization, extrapolation, those sorts of things that will allow us to, based on some experiential content, we can like extract it, take it out, and then generalize something about it, and then extrapolate from there and make further judgments. So take, for instance, things like just physics, say, we can, using our experiential, our experiences of phenomena that physics offers us, we can get an idea of like an atom and its structure. And then we can generalize and say, given the evidence, we can say that all atoms of this kind are going to be have this sort of structure. And then we can extrapolate to make our science more intricate, to explain more things and to fit a more unifying explanation of the physical world. So once we do that, those things, we can get beyond experience, because we're not acquainted with atoms or the other side of the universe and what it's like. But he thinks we can know about those things and we can refer to them. We can refer to galaxies far away and how they behave and the forces that apply to them and so on, and do so using these procedures, these like mental operations, mental processes that operate on initially material in experience. But yeah, I mean, there's another question about, does he need more things in his ontology that we have access to in experience to explain what more needs to be explained? So maybe you might say, well, hang on, yeah, his ontology is too sparse. Maybe you need powers, for instance, to explain some things that go on in science that you can't explain without powers, and that would be a challenge to him in that regard.
Un momento. Ok, entonces vamos a hacer una pausa de 10 minutos. Volvemos enseguida para los que nos siguen por YouTube. Nos vemos en 10 minutos en el canal. Thank you very much, Anthony. This shall continue. Okay. Let's go for a coffee tea.
Okay, and I'll
Está todo acá afuera.
Very
Okay.
yeah.
And I wonder if you're going to
So you'll need
Thank you.
no costes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I was trying to tell you that I silenced the meeting. Okay, we're done.
I press continue.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Continue what? Continue now muting. Okay,
It came up and said,
you're
continue.
silenced. Continue to activate the microphone.
Yeah, reactivate. Yeah, it was reactivate and continue without. No worries. Another. Okay. Okay, Carlo, I'm ready when you are. I think other folks, they're looking ready. So, shall I begin? Yeah. Okay, we're going to come back from our break and we're going to go on to what I have classified as lecture 2. And what we're going to do now is discuss the impact that Williams had on analytic philosophy and draw some lessons for the history of analytic philosophy. And also, as I said, we can open up, if you want, a discussion about what you think analytic metaphysics today is like, what it should be like, where it should go. Those sort of things I think are interesting questions to me, because I do the history of analytic philosophy, but I also do analytic metaphysics as well. Okay, so let's go through some impact. And some of this is going to be sort of giving you some information, historical context, but then I want to start showing some argumentative threads through Williams to Lewis and to Armstrong to really show you the line of influence, the connections, instead of just saying, oh yeah, you know, Lewis's view is like Williams' view, or yeah, he was Williams is one of Lewis's teachers, so yeah, he influenced him. Those are, you know, just vague remarks, and I think we can do better and do so empirically. So we use some evidence here. So you'll find that I will also appeal to research that I've conducted on Lewis's archive and even Williams' archive and also Armstrong's archive in putting this together. This is Williams's book, by the way, Principles of Empirical Realism from 1966. I have a copy of it here to show you real physical. This is what books used to look like. Not PDFs. There weren't PDFs back then. Okay, so here's some sort of information and historical context now. So I'm going to start with Lewis and the connection with Armstrong, Williams and Lewis, and then I'll go on to Williams and Armstrong. I'll probably speed up at that point. Okay, so Lewis, he goes to Harvard to do his PhD in 1962, and he shows up with an interest in ethics and philosophy of mind, and he moves into metaphysics, philosophy of language, modal logic, semantics, philosophy of science even, as he gets immersed in his graduate studies at Harvard. And he took classes with Quine and many other folks. He also went to Brandeis and took classes with Goodman. But I'm just sort of highlighting the connection with Williams. So he sat in on Williams' metaphysics course in fall 1963. He enrolled in cosmology, which is more of a focused course on time and causation, and like persistence and those sorts of things, and even time travel in the spring of 65. And in this course, Lewis wrote a term paper on the identity theory of the mind, and that term paper became Lewis's first publication, an argument for the identity theory. Then the following year, or later that year or the next academic year, he audits metaphysics again, but Williams is like at each iteration of these different courses, he's improving the course, adding new content, and so on as well. So this is showing you just some of the interactions that Lewis was having with Williams. And here's a letter, a snippet of a letter to Jerry Schaefer, which was Lewis's former undergraduate teacher at Swarthmore. And he's writing in October 1965, and he says to Jerry, "Things are going well for us." He's referring to David and Steffi. He just got married to Steffi at this point. Though we're kept busy, I'm supposed to be working on my thesis. Uh-oh, he's not doing that. And I'll get to work on it almost any day now. Unfortunately, there are some interesting courses which require work that I can fill forward. So there, he's referring to auditing Williams's class and really wanting to take this in and sort of putting off writing his thesis, his dissertation. And then the other stuff is about him applying for jobs as well. Okay, so what happens is he applies to a job in ... He applies to UCLA, and he and Steffi go to UCLA. So Lewis ends up in California. He's at UCLA, assistant professor in 1966. He has to go back to defend his dissertation in 67, but he's there in California. He's in LA. Williams, the following year, he retires, and he goes back to California, his home state, and he buys a house. I think that might have built a house in Fallbrook, up in the mountains, amongst the avocado groves, and he's only 2 hours away from LA. And at this time as well, Williams, when he retired, he was still quite active. He gave his own papers at various talks in California. He still corresponded with people near and far, and he also had people visit, like David Lewis. There's young David Lewis visiting Donald Williams there at his home. And then, of course, when you get together like this, you discuss philosophy, which what the two of them are doing. So what does Lewis get from Williams? So I'll run through a couple of these things. So he gets the four-dimensionalism from Williams, and Williams isn't the only source for this. So I want to sort of highlight this. Quine also says things about conceiving of objects four-dimensionally, and Lewis certainly was reading that and was aware of like Quine's position on this. So there's many sources for four-dimensionalism, but Williams is certainly one of them, and his view is a really realist one, like this is how he thinks things really are, whereas one Quinean interpretation might give you a less robust metaphysical reading of four-dimensionalism in Quine. Time travel, both Williams and Lewis thought that time travel was possible, and Williams's actualism is actually quite similar to Lewis's Humene's convenience. So Williams's actualism was there is a plurality of actual determinate things or contents, and they've got properties or qualities, and they stand in relations. What are those relations? Space-time, parthood, and resemblance, and that's it. Everything else can be grounded on that. And Lewis's Humene's convenience is put forth in the same way and in the same spirit as well, where you just got your four-dimensional manifold, qualities located at regions, and yes, you've got sets of those things and sums of those things and relative sums of those things, and resemblance is sort of for free. And and we want to build causation and laws of nature, counterfactuals, and everything else based on this Humene's convenience base. So Williams' actualism resembles Lewis's Humene's convenience, and they also function in the same way for both thinkers. Lewis also exploits analogies between space and time in the same way that Williams did. So Williams thought that time very much in some ways, not all, of course, is analogous to space, and time is just another extent in which things can exist. So we can talk about problems of change, where you've got, say, me standing, and then a few moments later, I'm falling over, and there's this question about how did I change over this sort of stretch of time, and for Williams and for Lewis, they're going to say, well, at each moment, there's a temporal part of you, and the way that you change is in terms of the temporal part having different properties. So the temporal part, me here, which is one temporal part, standing, has a property of standing, and then the later temporal part has a property of having fallen over. Okay. Another analogy that Lewis exploits is an analogy between time and modality now. So he likes understanding time as analogous to space due to Williams, and then he finds a way to exploit a similar analogy between time and modality. So this helps Lewis in arguing for and motivating his theory of modality, which is what's called modal realism. This view says there's a polarity of worlds. These worlds are spatio-temporally disconnected from each other, but each world is a unified sum of space-time stuff and things located in these disconnected space-times. You can imagine like raisins, or you can imagine olives in a focaccia, let's say, and all the olives are distinct possible worlds. So our world is one among many. We are just one olive among all the olives in the focaccia. And all of the worlds are of the same kind, the same category, whatever that category is going to be. Okay, so that's roughly the view, modal realism, with reference to focaccia. Now, the problem of contingent predication, which is similar to the problem of change over time. So I'm standing at this time, and then I fall down at a later time, is a change. But there's also this modal change as well, if you will. So I'm standing, but I could have been sitting. How do we explain that fact? Well, Lewis says there is a world, and in that world, there is a counterpart of me that's sitting. Now, we don't want to say that it's literally me in that other world, because then we'd have a contradiction where I have the property of standing and I have the property of sitting, and those are contradictory properties on this assumption. So we have to say that the subjects of those properties, the things that have those properties, are actually distinct. And here, again, there's this analogy between time modality that relates to the persistence case. So just like me now, the temporal part, distinct from the temporal part in the future, similarly, the counterpart in the other world is distinct from me. And Lewis was thinking in these ways. In his letters, he explains to Alan Hazen how he arrived at counterpart theory, and it was working through this problem with this analogy in the back of his mind, which he gets from Williams. I may jump over this point because I'll get a bit it gets detailed. But another thing that Lewis gets from Williams is the indexical count of actuality. And let me just state the view and then show how it's relevant. So Lewis is a modal realist, and we have this question about the status of actuality, what being actual means. So on the indexical count of actuality, the word actual and the concept is indexical, just like the word now or the word here. Those are indexical words that are indexed to, pegged to the person who's uttering that word in a sentence. So when I say I'm here, referring to where I am right here, and not to another place. Of course, the reference can move if I move and say, I'm over here now, for instance. So similarly, the word actual is working the same way. The word actual refers to the world that you're in when you utter that word in a sentence. So actuality is a relative matter for Lewis, and actuality is relative to each world. So in the background here, we've got our worlds. Let's say these are like our olives and the focaccia. And anyone that's in this world can say, hey, I'm actual. And they're correct. They're referring to their world. And similarly, someone over here in the red world can say, I'm actual. And they're also right. They're referring to what's going on in their world. So that's the indexical count of actuality. One reason why Lewis likes it is it can help us explain how worlds are all of the same kind. And there's no ontological difference between worlds. They're all concrete, for instance. Okay, so the way that Lewis gets to this view, this account of actuality, is through something that Williams says here. When Williams is thinking through Leibniz's view about an ontology of essence and existence. So in some places, Leibniz has this view where you've got essences and you've got existence, and they all exist, they're all equally real. And then Williams points out, well, hang on, if that's correct, then how can you, Leibniz or anyone, tell that you are a member of the existent world? How can you tell you are an existent and you're not some essence on the shelf of essence, as Williams likes to poetically put it? So this is the beginnings of an argument where you can fall into skepticism about your existence on the Leibnizian picture, because the essence is just as real as being an existence, but there's no way for you to, no indicator to say, oh, actually, I'm an existent, not an essence. They're both equally real. Okay, so then Lewis has a similar, has a similar argument where we have all the possible worlds. Again, look to the background image. Those are all possible worlds. They're all equally real. So how do I know that I'm not some mere possible entity? I'd fall into skepticism about my own actuality. Now, of course, we know that we're actual. So falling into skepticism is a bad thing because we're failing to explain something that we know, which is that we are actual. So what this problem does is it motivates the indexical account of actuality. So we can just say, hey, the actual world is indexical. And yes, the people over there in the red world, let's say, they're right when they use the word actual. In the same way that if I say it's now, I'm not wrong about referring to the time that I'm referring to. Just like how I can say I'm here and I'm correct, and you can say I'm here and you're also correct. We can both be correct because actual is indexical, actual is relative. Okay, so here's Lewis telling us, here's some evidence now in his letters that this is where the influence lies. So he's writing to Jack Smart, and Williams has just died in 1983. And he's saying, Jack Smart, I don't know if you knew Williams, but he's dead. He retired in California, and Catherine is the wife of Williams. And then Lewis says, crucially, studying with him was one reason why I think there's more to metaphysics than can be read in word and object. Quine's famous book. I hope you'll agree that he, Williams, was a good influence. My present views, modal realism, can be traced partly, not wholly, of course, partly to this question, how Leibniz knew that he himself was not an unactualized monad. Now, of course, he goes on to qualify this because most people don't like modal realism. So he says, look, mate, you might, I'm worried that you will think that it was a bad influence, but I think it was a good influence because I think modal realism is the right view to hold. Okay, I'll sort of briefly go over these quotes, but there's more examples in his letters which show this appreciation for Williams, and Williams as a systematic philosopher. And for Lewis, in fact, he thought that both Quine and Williams were systematic metaphysicians. And we can come back to this later as well. Okay, here's another argument or similarity which Lewis is getting from Williams. So again, with realism, which is a view that there is a plurality of worlds. And what Lewis does in the book on the plurality of worlds is he gives what I call a serviceability argument, where he says that monorealism is true because it's a serviceable hypothesis. And that's what he says here. This is Lewis down here. Why do I believe in monorealism? That's because the hypothesis is serviceable. And here's the crucial inference as well. Because given that it's serviceable, we have a reason to believe it's true, most likely to be true. And how we have Williams here in 1953 arguing for tropes, not monorealism, and he's saying, here, what I'm going to do in this paper is give you a theory which I have found serviceable, and so much so that it's most likely to be true. So I take Williams to be offering a serviceability argument for trope theory, and Lewis is doing a similar thing with monorealism. He's also offering a serviceability argument as well. Okay, now we go to Armstrong. Armstrong's on the right in this picture, the young Armstrong.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with a couple of contextual facts, bit of history, and then get into some details with Armstrong and move on to the lessons next. Okay, so I know that Armstrong brought principles of empirical realism in 1967. I've seen Armstrong's copy of the book, and he marked in the front 1967. In 1968, Armstrong goes to Stanford on a visiting position. He's there for about a semester, and he gives a talk at Irvine on the 1st of February 1968. And he gives a paper on secondary qualities, colors, for example. In this same month, he visits Williams in Fallbrook, in the same way that Lewis would go around the same time to visit Williams. So there's another photo of Williams there up on his house, very high up in the mountain in Fallbrook. Okay, so here's a letter by Williams just after the visit. So the talk was on the 1st of February, and then the 6th of February after Armstrong visited, we have Williams saying, "We remember your visit with the greatest pleasure and join in a cordial greeting to both of you. Yours faithfully done." Nice sort of ending to a letter. You don't get the letters like this anymore. Okay, so this this time is very important historically, because at this talk is when Armstrong and Lewis meet for the first time. And I don't know for sure whether Williams attended this talk, but there's a good chance he did, given the closeness to when Williams and Armstrong are writing. But I don't know for sure. But that talk is where the two of them meet, and from here they have this. It took a couple of years to get going, but this is the beginning point of their philosophical relationship and also their personal relationship. And these two thinkers influenced each other, also similarly have a common source in Williams, but also go on to influence metaphysics in a very profound way. And of course, we could have a whole book on these two figures. But I was just trying to show the importance of that meeting in 1968, which is related to Armstrong actually going to visit Williams, showing at least one thing, that he takes Williams and his work seriously, and was reading it very closely. Here's another sort of connection with Williams and Armstrong. So this here is a snippet from the inside cover of Armstrong's book, A World of States of Affairs. And in that book, it's from the 1997, he's giving a systematic exposition of an ontology of states of affairs. And he starts off, well, in the front, he has this some quotes to set up the parameters of his project. And part of his project is what's the nature of my enterprise here? Well, what it is grubbing about in the roots of being. And he's got some quote here, it's actually a paraphrase of Williams. And he knows it, but he sort of altered it a little bit. So where it comes from is from here, from a paper by Williams. It's from the 30s, from 1934, actually. It's reprinted in this book in 66. I think Armstrong read it in this book in the 60s and probably the 70s as well. And what Williams is saying here is, when it comes to philosophy and metaphysics, it's not some higher or super scientific enterprise that we can reflect on using reason and doing some a priori inferences. So philosophy, metaphysics isn't like that. Instead, it's the lowest and the grubbiest inquiry around the roots of things. So things get very dirty doing metaphysics. And when it's real questions about the world, it is philosophy, it is, and can only be an inductive science. So again, it's sort of harking back to this empirical method in metaphysics that Williams used and advocated for. And Armstrong's doing a similar thing in his metaphysics of states of affairs. Now, what else does Armstrong owe Williams? One other thing is this important point about in Armstrong about a posteriori realism. So in Armstrong's book, Realism and Scientific Universals and Scientific Realism, he argues that there are immanent universals. Those are universals that are in the things, in the instances. But he goes on to say that science discovers what kind of universals exist. We can't deduce a priori the existence of certain kinds of universals. We should defer to science, sort of employ a posteriori realism. So this is an important point in Armstrong. It's one of Armstrong's main contributions to metaphysics. And we find this move made in Williams as well. So when Williams talks about naturalism, which is like a materialist, physicalist picture of the world, he sketches it in such a way that it says that there is a one world and it's a world of space-time, and he says that he gives a physicalist design of the world order, but doesn't say anything further about the precise nature of these ultimate elements, besides just saying that they are spatio-temporal. And he also uses language of patterns of action as well. So we're saying some things, but we're not filling in all of the picture, because we should let science give us more of the picture about, are these fundamental elements fields? Are they really atoms, or are they something else entirely? We'll defer to science for that matter. Another thing he says when he advocates for naturalism is that it presupposes the existence of universals, he thinks, but it doesn't say which ones exactly exist, besides saying in a very general way, they must be in space-time, or they must be spatio-temporal. Again, Williams has this thought in his mind that the precise details about which universals exist should be deferred to science. So what Williams is doing is he's distinguishing a logical/ontological issue about what's the fundamental category of being and whether universals exist, for instance, and then a factual issue about what kinds of things exist in reality and the world once we've decided our ontology. And that's basically the move that Armstrong's making in universals and scientific realism. I also think that some of this influence on Armstrong is coming from Jack Smart. So I don't want to say it's coming solely from Williams, but Williams, I think, is playing an important role. All right, now then move on to the lessons, and this will sort of push us towards having a bit of discussion, I hope, about the history of analytic metaphysics, and then where we're going as well. Okay, so here's a couple of things that I think come out, some lessons that we can extract. So one thing is, what is revived, what survives because of Williams, is a systematic way of thinking. Being a system builder. Williams was a system builder, Lewis was, and also Armstrong. Now, this isn't building a system like a Hegelian system where you've got this grand picture that you must accept all of it or not at all. Instead, it's sort of piecing together a system bit by bit. And you can think of it as like a package deal where you can change some of the parts and modify some of the parts if you have to. It's kind of like going to a buffet, and you could pick on the different foods to make the best meal, as it were. Another thing that we find is that the metaphysics today and of the late 20th century is harking back to big questions, to traditional concern for big questions about the world and our place in it. And there's also some constructive inquiry going on where the place of argument is to expound and to build a metaphysical theory as well. So I'm going to touch on these points and also reiterate that the revival of metaphysics is a story about the anti-metaphysics revolutions failing in the middle of the 20th century. So before and after, we have the same thing going on, and sort of things get back to normal, as it were. There was a coup, and it didn't work out, and things have gone sort of back to normal for the better. So we should think of this period as a revolutionary period. All right. So here's Lewis, and he is talking about himself in this quote, and then he talks about Armstrong here. And this just sort of tie in some of the points I've just made. So Lewis says, I'm an old-fashioned analytic metaphysician in pursuit of hypotheses. Again, it's an empirical claim, empirical hypothesis about what things are the elements of being. Again, it's a reference back to Williams, and about how all else may be reduced to patterns of these elements. So the elements and patterns of being. So he wants to characterize himself fashioned after Williams's approach to metaphysics. And he also says it of Armstrong himself. So in this letter, he's writing a letter of reference to someone else about Armstrong. So he's an analytic philosopher of a rather old-fashioned sort, just like Lewis. And at least in Armstrong's case, he wasn't influenced too much by the linguistic term. Another thing Lewis says of Armstrong, again, this touches on the other point in Lewis's self-characterization, is, hey, this guy, he's a system builder. Yep, we've noted that. And his question is this: what sorts of elements of being must there be? And what ways of combining them must there be? Again, that's the ways of combining is the patterns. The patterns of being, the pattern of the elements to make up the world, or to make a world of the sort we know from experience in science and common sense. So again, we want to be explaining these things, explaining what's given in experience from science and ordinary experience, and explain those things with a hypothesis about the fundamental elements, whatever they are, and the patterns. And again, he's using these words in a very loose way, where the elements of being for Lewis will be concrete individuals and classes and sets, whereas for Armstrong, they're going to be universals and perhaps substances and laws of nature, perhaps, and things like that. But the point is, this characterization is harking back to Williams. So the two of them thought of themselves as more on an older traditional path. Okay, so I'll just go to this point, which is just that, again, we should think of this period in the middle of the 20th century as this revolution, this coup that didn't fail. There was a riot in the metaphysical Capitol building, and it didn't work out. The insurrection failed. Okay, here's some quotes by Williams about metaphysics. I'll just skip over them because at least the time. But I'll just briefly say that one thing that I think is important for Williams is when you do metaphysics, you have to be you have to have a vision of reality. You have to have a standpoint from which you see the world and how you want to build up everything in your world. That's very important. So here's an example just to plug in to Lewis, for instance. So Lewis, he has this Humean vision of reality, and he's not going to budge from that standpoint. He takes it as true, and he doesn't know how to explain it fully, but he can't justify it any more than telling us about his vision, his frame of mind, and motivating his perspective. Now, from that perspective, you need to have a perspective from somewhere, and then build up from there. And Lewis holds that Humean perspective, that Humean vision. You can, of course, hold a different vision, an anti-Humean one, perhaps, and go ahead and at your project just to build up that vision. But you've got to have a vision. That's what the good philosopher does. I'll just jump over that. I'll talk about this. So when we think of metaphysics in this way of, hey, I have a vision, a perspective on the world, and I need to build up a theory that explains what needs to be explained, argumentation and the place of argument takes on a different role. Now, of course, argument still is relevant for arguing about problems and deal with objections and so on. The one key thing that argumentation does is it helps us expound a position, a theory. So here's Lewis who says, look, arguments, they can always be controverted. You can always deny some premise and still hold your line, even if you have to add in extra commitments, which might sound a bit crazy. You can still do that. What's the purpose of philosophical arguments? They are to expound a position, not to coerce agreement, to force your opponent to believe something. So it's a very constructive way, a very positive way of thinking about argumentation. And Lewis adds, and this is a letter that's unpublished, where he says, I don't agree with you at all that taking a side in philosophy involves a certain duty to refute rivals. I think philosophical debate almost always reaches stalemate. So you'll get impasses very quickly. And here's what you should be doing. Your job is to arrive at a position you yourself can believe, and then think it through well enough that you can't be refuted. So the position that you yourself can believe, it's a vision that you have that's sensible to you, and then you can defend it from objections, and you can use argumentation to help explain and expound your theory. That's what you need to do. And this is what Lewis did in his work. I'll just talk about that. Okay. So again, looking back at this larger narrative, logical positivists in their revolution, when that began to wane, this desire that we always had to understand the world sort of resurfaced. And Frederick Compelson, who sort of known the history of philosophy, describes the mind of the metaphysician, which is to want to understand ultimate reality. And part of understanding ultimate reality is to systematize it, to unify things in it, to explain things, to build things, make these things intelligible to us, make these things explanatorily satisfying. So the sort of traditional way of doing philosophy resurfaces because people are free to go back to this natural disposition that we had to understand the world in its ultimate way. However you cash out the word ultimate, of course. So sort of going back to old way of things, but with the continuity there, because Williams helped things along into the latter half of the 20th century. And of course, there are still new tools and new methods that we have today that weren't around before. And that's part of how we get progress in philosophy, is you can be asking the same questions, but with new tools and methods also. So 21st century metaphysics shouldn't lose sight of this sort of, that we're quite traditional in our metaphysics. And perhaps we should have some sort of focus to finding questions and formulating questions from outside philosophy. That would also be a way to sort of move philosophy forward as well. That's it.
Anthony, muchas gracias por la conferencia. Tenemos un espacio, 5 minutos, tal vez un poco más, para preguntas. No sé si alguien tendría. Pía, por favor, adelante. En la medida de lo posible, lo más sintético. Anthony, try to answer as briefly as possible. Yeah, I'm Kyle.
Mine is a very naive question because it's not my area or my field of work. I do political philosophy, feminist political philosophy. So it's just this question about the larger picture. So I was wondering, because I saw someone working on trying to trace the role of women in the history of analytic philosophy. So I wanted to ask you about the women in the sort of larger picture. I mean, there's someone that you know that maybe might have had contact or relations with Williams in this sort of weird period that you were describing.
Yes, I don't know of any women. I guess there is a couple of women in 20th century philosophy that are sort of part of the story. So one woman is Dorothy Emmett. She was a British philosopher at Manchester. She was a student of Whitehead and also a student of Samuel Alexander and a successor to Samuel Alexander at Manchester. And she was writing this time, and she also defended metaphysics in her own sort of way. And she has a very great book called The Nature of Metaphysical Thinking, and some papers on criticizing the conception of analysis that logical positivists and British analytic philosophers had in this time period. And Williams knew of this book, and he certainly read Emmett's book, The Nature of Metaphysical Thinking, and had a correspondence with her, and he thought very highly of it. So he did have some connections with some women, and they are relevant they are part of this larger story in the history of analytic philosophy.
Kyle, yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious, in the spirit of maybe thinking about where we want metaphysics to go. The last quotes you had from Lewis, you made me feel a little bit of tension between two different kinds of. So I've always thought that one of the reasons why the coup failed, the logic positive coup failed, was because when we realized that we can actually do philosophy in this kind of realistic, naturalistic style, taking from science, or at least the outer reaches of science, and looking at theory comparison and stuff, it made metaphysics look tractable in the sense that, like, oh, well, we've got these different kinds of metaphysical theories, and all we need to do is apply the same methods we wouldn't on the outer reaches of physics to see, like, what's the simpler theory and what's the most explanatory theory and what's the most coherent theory, But then Lewis is kind of seeming to suggest that maybe it's just the nature of metaphysics is such that it's always going to be intractable. You're only supposed to convince yourself. So it's kind of like rationalizing your own world vision, which I kind of thought maybe analytic metaphysics was, the way it started was to kind of get around it. So I will wonder if you want to come down on one or the other side.
Nice, yeah. Yes, good. Yeah, I think at this point here, we could also try to find some contrast with Armstrong, for instance, where maybe Armstrong wouldn't follow Lewis in also saying some of these things as well. So this is, I think, in the spirit very much of Lewis in the introduction to Philosophical Papers 1. He talks about finding a reflective equilibrium between your sort of firm beliefs and then how your theory gets developed, and you want to find this equilibrium, and that reflective equilibrium that resting point can be different for different people, for different standpoints. So as a kind of a personal endeavor, and maybe you could generalize it to say maybe the job is to arrive at a position that includes like something collective, like we can all believe. So maybe then we could say, okay, well, what do we think our best science is saying? Okay, how can we build up this position together? And that could help to bring in, make it more of a collective endeavor about us sort of pushing philosophy forward, as opposed to this very kind of like autistic, in a non-pejorative sense, a very, narrow. In some ways, it is like that. It's a very sort of narrow. You might think of it, read it in a sort of narrow sort of way, where you're trying to, find out what you believe, and that's it, with many different starting points.
Okay. Bueno, me gustaría hacer la última pregunta a mí, ya que yo invité a Anthony a esta actividad que les voy a gustar ese privilegio. So Anthony, here's a last question I want to ask you. So if you let me just challenge a bit, not challenge, but ask you about like an alternative narrative to the one that you were trying to advance in your talk. So roughly your picture is that you got a revolt here, right? And then before that, this is metaphysics, right? I hear, metaphysics again, right? But then, like, there's some people, right, mostly from the, like, that's my sense at least, like philosophy of physics, literature, that would push back against this narrative and somehow say that you're wrong in dating this as a sort of an open arrow, where like, their revolt was squashed and like metaphysicians are back into business, like doing what they were doing for this like annoying bunch of people showed up. And then maybe stretch this period to, I don't know, maybe 1990 something, 2000, right? What nowadays metaphysicians are doing is just debating about the status of metaphysics and ontology. And if we think something along the lines of Kuhn's theory or in the vicinity of it is true, and these people are not doing metaphysics anymore, but rather talking about metaphysics and different paradigms about this discipline, what we should infer from that data, right, when I call it that way, is that really metaphysics enter into a phase of decadence, right? But not because it was a party of philosophers trying to, overthrow it, but rather because it seems that even in the sort of foundational debates of the discipline, how it should be carried out, etc., there's like a dead divide, and there's no like kind of a first order production of metaphysical theories and whatnot, like people like Williams, Lewis, and Armstrong did back in his time. So your thoughts about that? Sorry.
So I mean, I want to agree with you with some of what you said, with how we interpret things occurring in the 90s and even to today, where what happened was we got so much metaphysics going on in the 70s, 80s, and even a lot in the 90s, and then it sort of went meta, and that's sort of, there was like little little blips of meta, maybe in the early noughts, and then it got even bigger, out of control, perhaps. Where now everyone's just talking about metaphysics, reflecting on the methods, the tools, and stuff like that. And then there's this question of, okay, has metaphysics run its course? We've done all this first order stuff, and now we're just spinning around and talking about how we talk about metaphysics, and we may then, like the metaphysical car may break down, the wheel may fall off it or something like that. So, I mean, I think that's a reasonable interpretation of what's going on here, like post 2000. I mean, I was also abrupt with saying, well, 2000 is like the cutoff point, because metaphysics continued as well. So, I want to agree with you on that, and I also accept that there is some important tools and methods that we do get from Carnap and other quintessential logical positivists. Weigel, for instance, because Weigel was also crucial in forwarding the identity theory of mind alongside Place and Smart and Armstrong also. Yeah, those things, there was some little impacts there as well from them. So I don't want to sort of say once the revolution failed, there was no lasting impact. But as I trace these threads through, as I've shown with Lewis and Armstrong, just like focus on the aspect of metaphysics, we can really find that thread going all the way back, because if we do our history carefully, we can connect these dots. We can say Lewis Armstrong, Louis Williams, you've got Savory and Ralph Eaton and Perry and Russell and so on, and Alexander influencing Williams. So then we can get it all the way back to about here, where we had this rich age of speculation and synoptic, all-comprehensive sort of inquiry, where we had these grand systems being produced, like Alexander and Whitehead, and even McTaggart, for instance, in the 20s as well.
Ok, muchas gracias, Anthony. Haber aceptado nuestra invitación. Invito a todos los presentes y sé que hay alguien en el canal de YouTube a un workshop que tenemos organizado para el próximo jueves. No sé si va a ser exactamente en esta sala u otra del tercer piso, pero comienza a las 3 de la tarde hasta las 6:30. La invitación es abierta, así que los esperamos. Muchas gracias. Nos vemos.
¿Puedo pedir una foto del grupo?
Sí, claro, por supuesto.
Maybe over here, away from the lights.
Yeah, that light.
I think we can
I'll turn it off. Yeah.
here. Yeah,
Okay.
Una foto, sí, por favor. Bueno, los que quieran, no. Esto no es una trampa.
Los salen de aquí.
Kyle, do you want to? No, not necessary.